You ever feel like your life's stuck on repeat, and you're just watching it happen? That's how I'd describe mine. Emily, 36, suburban Denver resident, married to David, a man whose life was more about business trips than building memories. When David announced yet another 2-week work trip, I just nodded. No arguments, no questions. "I'll call when I land," he said, pecking my cheek in a way that didn't feel like a kiss but a routine. The door clicked shut, and there I was, alone with the silence. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was just louder this time. Later that evening, I was in the middle of reheating pasta when the porch light started flickering like it had a mind of its own. As I grabbed my phone to Google electricians, a knock at the door made me pause. Who even knocks on doors anymore? Peeking through the peephole, I saw him. Marcus. My neighbor. He'd moved in 6 months ago, and while we exchanged the occasional wave or polite chat, I didn't know much about him except that he looked solid. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an effortless ease about him that made you wonder if he ever had a bad day. "Hey," he said as I opened the door just a crack. His voice was warm, casual, like we'd known each other for years. "Sorry to bother you, but your porch light's flickering. Thought you'd want to know." "Oh, thanks," I said, tugging the sleeves of my old hoodie self-consciously. "I've been meaning to fix it. I've got some spare bulbs," he offered. "If you want, I can swap it out for you real quick."
Normali, ide puliteli da klina.
But something about the way he stood there, calm and unassuming, made me step aside.
Sure.
"Come on in." Marcus made quick work of the bulb, his movements sure and confident. I watched from the doorway, trying not to focus on how natural he looked here, as if this wasn't the first time he'd stepped into my life. "There you go. Good as new," he said, hopping down from the edge of the porch with a grin. "Thanks," I said, folding my arms. "I owe you one." "That's what neighbors are for," he replied. His words were light, but his eyes lingered a little longer than they should have. When he left, the space he'd occupied felt strangely charged, like he'd left something behind. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Let me know if you need help with anything else. Happy to lend a hand." I didn't need to guess who it was. My heart stuttered. It was just a friendly gesture, right? Or was it? I typed back a quick reply. "Thanks, Marcus. I appreciate it." Short, polite, safe. But as I set my phone down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The next day, the monotony continued. Coffee, emails, laundry. Around noon, as I wiped down the counter, the steady plunk of the dripping kitchen faucet got on my nerves. It had been broken for weeks. David had promised to fix it, one of many promises he never seemed to get around to. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and texted. "Hey, Marcus. Do you know anything about fixing faucets? Mine's been driving me crazy." His reply came almost immediately. "I'll be there in 10. 10 minutes later, he was at my door, toolbox in hand, looking every bit like someone who could solve your problems. "Show me the culprit," he said, flashing a grin. While he worked under the sink, I leaned against the counter, making small talk. He told me about his job as a graphic designer, how he loved hiking, and how he moved here for a fresh start after a breakup. "It's been nice," he said, glancing up. "Good to have a change of scenery. And good neighbors." I felt heat rise to my cheeks and turned away. "Well, you've been a great neighbor so far." When he finished, he turned the faucet handle with a flourish. "Good as new." "You're a lifesaver," I said. "How much do I owe you?"
"Nothing," he laughed.
"Call it payback for the Wi-Fi I borrowed." I laughed too, though I couldn't remember giving him the password. Later that evening, I was scrolling aimlessly on my phone when a notification popped up. Marcus had followed me on Instagram. My heart skipped. After a moment of hesitation, I tapped follow back. It felt like a small, insignificant action. But as I set my phone down, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he smiled, how easy it was to talk to him, how long it had been since I'd felt seen. I told myself it was nothing. Just a neighbor being nice. Harmless. Right? Marcus showed up at my door the next day, toolbox in hand, with the kind of energy that made it seem like fixing faucets was his weekend hobby. I figured you might need a proper fix instead of a quick patch-up, he said, stepping inside. I wasn't going to argue. Between David's eternal absences and the countless things I had to keep up with on my own, I wasn't about to turn down help. As Marcus worked under the sink, I leaned against the counter, watching his steady movements. You really didn't have to come back, I said, though part of me was glad he did. He grinned, glancing up briefly. What kind of neighbor would I be if I didn't? There was something about the way he said it, light, casual, but tinged with something warmer. It had been a long time since anyone went out of their way for me without an obligation attached. So, I said, trying to break the silence, what's a graphic designer doing fixing faucets on his day off? He laughed softly, the sound reverberating in the small kitchen. Let's just say I've learned to be handy over the years. Comes with being a homeowner and, well, living alone. The words hung there for a moment, heavier than I expected. I shifted. You mentioned before you moved here for a fresh start? Yeah, he said, tightening a pipe. Denver's a good place to reset. After the divorce, I needed space. A blank slate, you know? Not really. My marriage wasn't falling apart in the dramatic, obvious way divorce suggests. It was more like a ship slowly sinking without anyone noticing until the water was already at your knees. I get that, I said quietly. Do you? He asked, glancing at me. His eyes were sharp, searching, as if he could see straight through the polite facade I wore every day. I hesitated. Kind of. David and we've been married for 10 years. But it's not the same as it used to be. He's always gone. Work, travel. It's like we're just two people sharing a house now. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, and the moment they were out, I felt a rush of embarrassment. Why was I unloading this on Marcus, of all people? He didn't look surprised, though. If anything, his expression softened. That sounds lonely, he said simply. It is, I admitted. The honesty felt both terrifying and liberating. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady drip of water into a bucket under the sink. You know, he said, breaking the silence, divorce wasn't easy. But it taught me a lot about what I want and don't want in life. Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to keep things together that we forget to ask ourselves if it's worth it. I blinked at him. His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Sorry, he said quickly, sitting back and wiping his hands on a rag. I didn't mean to get all philosophical on you. No, it's fine, I said. Sometimes you need to hear it. He smiled at that, a small, knowing smile. The faucet gave a satisfying click as he turned it off, the dripping finally silenced. There. Shouldn't give you any more trouble now. Thank you, I said, genuinely grateful. You didn't have to do all this. He shrugged, standing and packing up his tools. Like I said, what kind of neighbor would I be? As he moved toward the door, he paused, looking back at me. If you ever need help with anything else, faucets, lights, whatever, just let me know. I will, I said, but the words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried a weight I couldn't quite name. When he left, the house felt quieter than usual. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, replaying our conversation in my head. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them, the way he looked at me, like I wasn't invisible. And that was new. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was fading into the background. Someone saw me. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, my mind racing. Marcus had mentioned divorce, starting over, finding something new. Was I brave enough to admit that part of me wanted the same? I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence, and wondered what Marcus would say if he knew just how much his words had shaken me. The invitation came out of nowhere. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a message for Marcus. Hey, I'm grilling tonight. Just a few burgers and beers. If you're free, stop by. I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart picking up speed. It was just a casual invitation, nothing loaded, nothing that should make me hesitate. But my thumb hovered over the keyboard longer than I wanted to admit before I finally replied. Sure. Sounds fun. What time? By the time I stepped into Marcus's backyard, the smell of charcoal and sizzling meat filled the air. His yard was simple but cozy, a weathered wooden table, string lights glowing softly overhead, and a small grill in the corner. Marcus was leaning against it, a beer in one hand and tongs in the other. "Hey, Emily," he called out, flashing that easy grin. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, setting down the bottle of wine I'd brought. "Hope this makes me a decent guest." "Perfect guest," he said, gesturing toward the cooler. "Drinks are in there. Help yourself." I grabbed a soda, taking a moment to absorb the scene. It wasn't fancy, but there was something inviting about the simplicity of it all. "Nice setup," I said, taking a seat at the table. He chuckled, flipping a burger. "Don't be fooled. It's low maintenance, like me." I laughed. "Low maintenance? That's not the vibe you give off." "Oh," he asked, raising an eyebrow. "And what vibe do I give off?" "Confident," I said without thinking, then immediately felt my face heat up. "I mean, you just seem like you've got it all together." He smirked, shaking his head. "Far from it. But I appreciate the compliment." As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed as easily as the laughter. We talked about movies we loved, the ones we hated, and embarrassing childhood memories that made us both cringe and laugh until our stomachs hurt. "You really dressed as a hot dog for Halloween?" Marcus asked, grinning as he flipped the burgers. "I was 7 and it was my mom's idea," I said, groaning. "She thought it was cute." He laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that made me smile. "Well, at least it wasn't a fruit costume. My mom dressed me as a banana once. I'm still traumatized." "Now that's worse," I said, leaning back in my chair. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about laundry, bills, or David's absence. I wasn't thinking about anything except the moment I was in. After we ate, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his beer bottle dangling loosely in his hand. The conversation had slowed, but it didn't feel awkward. If anything, the silence was comfortable, the kind you share with someone who doesn't need constant words to fill the space. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "you're not what I expected." I blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" He smiled, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. "When I first moved in, I thought you'd be one of those neighbors who waves from a distance and keeps to themselves. But you're different." "Different how?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Alive," he said simply, his eyes meeting mine. "Like there's a part of you that's been buried for a while, but it's still there, just waiting to come out." The words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, like he wasn't just making an observation but calling out something I hadn't admitted to myself. I looked away, fiddling with the edge of my sleeve. "Maybe you're reading too much into it," I said softly. "Maybe," he said, but I could feel his gaze lingering. As the night wound down, Marcus walked me to the gate. The air was crisp, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to my jacket. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. "Thanks for inviting me," I replied. "It was nice." "Nice," he echoed, smirking. "Good to know my burgers passed the test." I laughed, shaking my head. It wasn't just the burgers. For a moment, we stood there, the silence stretching between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, like the air before a storm. "Well," I said finally, "good night." "Good night, Emily," he said, his voice softer than before. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Marcus was still standing by the gate, his hands in his pockets, watching me go. When I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart racing. Tonight had been harmless. Just a barbecue. Just a conversation. Just a neighbor being neighborly. Right? The morning after the barbecue, I woke up to a notification from Marcus. "How to share this?" made me think of last night. Attached was a meme about bad Halloween costumes, a callback to our hot dog and banana stories. I laughed out loud, something I hadn't done before 8 a.m. in, well, years. I typed back, "Okay, the banana might be worse, but don't underestimate the embarrassment of walking around with ketchup and mustard streaks." His reply came within seconds. "Touché. But at least you embrace the condiments." It was harmless, friendly, or at least that's what I told myself as the text continued throughout the day. By the end of the week, it had become a routine. Marcus would send me memes, random jokes, or funny stories about his day. At first, I answered casually, keeping it light and polite. But soon, I started looking forward to his messages. They were the highlights of my otherwise mundane days. It wasn't just the jokes. It was how he listened, how he remembered the little things I said, how he made me feel seen. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, he texted, "How's the Wi-Fi holding up? Any chance I can borrow it again?" I laughed, shaking my head, and typed back, "You're lucky I'm generous. What's the password?" "Oh, right. Emily is the best." He replied almost instantly, noted. Pretty accurate, though. The compliment was subtle, tucked into a joke, but it made my stomach flutter in a way I didn't want to think about too much. A few days later, Marcus sent me a picture of his dinner, a neatly plated steak with roasted vegetables. "Chef Marcus strikes again," the caption read. I replied, "Looks impressive. What's your secret?" "Cooking is just chemistry with better rewards." "I'll teach you sometime," he shot back. The idea of Marcus teaching me anything, standing close, his hands showing me what to do, made me pause. It was innocent, right? Just cooking. Just neighbors. But as I stared at his message, I couldn't help but wonder if there was an undertone I wasn't ready to admit. The messages became a constant. Morning check-ins. Afternoon memes. Evening conversations that stretched longer than they should. David's absence felt less suffocating with Marcus filling the empty spaces. One night, Marcus sent a picture of a coffee mug that read, "World's okayest neighbor." "I thought of you when I saw this," he wrote. I laughed, typing back, "Gee, thanks. Always good to aim for okayest." "Hey, you're the exception," he replied. "You're definitely in the best category." My thumb hesitated over the keyboard. What was I supposed to say to that? "Thank you? That's sweet." Instead, I settled for a lighthearted, "I'll take it. But no mugs for you yet." It wasn't until late one evening that I realized how much Marcus's messages had become a part of my day. David had called earlier, his voice distant as he rattled off updates about meetings and late dinners. I barely remembered the conversation 5 minutes after we hung up. But when my phone buzzed with another text from Marcus, a goofy meme about introverts, it pulled me back into focus. I laughed harder than I had in days. "This is way too relatable," I wrote back. "Thought so. You strike me as the quiet, secretly funny type," he replied. That message stayed with me.
Was I?
I never thought about it. David rarely noticed my humor anymore, let alone commented on it. But Marcus had picked up on it in less than a week. A few nights later, I was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine when Marcus sent a photo of the Denver skyline at sunset. "Thought you might like this," he wrote. I stared at the picture for a long moment. The sky was painted in rich oranges and purples, the city lights just starting to flicker on. I could imagine him standing there, looking out at the view, thinking of me. "It's beautiful," I replied. "You'd like it here." "We should catch a sunset sometime," he wrote back. The suggestion felt like a thread, dangling in front of me. I could grab it, let it pull me into something I wasn't sure I was ready for. Or I could let it go. Maybe, I typed, my heart racing. "If you're lucky." As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's messages became a lifeline. Each one was a small spark in my day, a reminder that someone out there cared, noticed, listened. I told myself it was harmless, just a neighbor being kind. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And maybe I didn't want it to stop. The invitation was casual, or at least that's how Marcus framed it. Cooking experiment tonight. Thought you might want to be my guinea pig, he texted, followed by a winking emoji. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Was this just another friendly gesture? Or something more? Before I could overthink it, I typed back. As long as it's not poison, I'm in. That evening, I stood at Marcus's front door, balancing a bottle of wine in one hand. When he opened the door, the smell of garlic and rosemary wafted out, warm and inviting. He was dressed casually, jeans and a dark green t-shirt that somehow made him look even more put together. Perfect timing, he said, stepping aside to let me in. Dinner's almost ready. His house was simple, but thoughtfully arranged. A few framed photos on the walls, a cozy couch, and a dining table set for two. The lights were dimmed just enough to make the room feel intimate. Smells amazing, I said, following him into the kitchen. He grinned, grabbing a pair of oven mitts. You haven't even seen the best part yet. Dinner was incredible. Roasted chicken, perfectly seasoned vegetables, and warm, crusty bread that he admitted he'd picked up from a local bakery. We ate at the table, laughing and talking about everything from bad first dates to the best food spots in Denver. You know, I said between bites, I'm starting to think you missed your calling. You could have been a chef. Nah, he said, leaning back in his chair. Cooking's just a hobby. Therapy, almost. Keeps me grounded. Grounded? I asked, curious. He hesitated, his expression softening. After the divorce, I needed something to focus on. Something to keep my hands busy while I figured out, well, life. I nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. I get that. Sometimes it's easier to pour yourself into something than face everything head-on. Exactly, he said, his eyes meeting mine. What about you? What's your escape? I thought for a moment, caught off guard by the question. I guess I don't really have one. Life's been more about getting through the day than finding anything to escape into. That's a shame, he said softly. Everyone deserves something that makes them feel alive. The way he said it made my heart skip. After dinner, Marcus disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 small bowls and a triumphant grin. For the grand finale, homemade chocolate mousse. Are you kidding me? I asked, laughing. You made mousse? Who even does that? He placed a bowl in front of me with a dramatic flourish. Try it and tell me it's not the best thing you've ever tasted. I dipped my spoon into the silky dessert and took a bite. The rich, velvety chocolate melted on my tongue, and I couldn't help but close my eyes. Okay, I said, opening my eyes to find him watching me intently. This is ridiculous. How are you even single? He laughed, but there was something deeper in his expression. That's a question I'd been asking myself for a while. The words hung in the air between us, and for the first time all evening, I felt the shift. The easy laughter, the light banter, all of it had led to this moment. You're incredible, Emily, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't know if you realize that. My breath caught. I'm just me. And that's enough, he said, leaning forward slightly. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. The intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his presence, it was all too much and not enough at the same time. I should probably, I started, but he interrupted gently. Don't, he said. You don't have to explain anything or rush off. Just let this be what it is. We moved to the couch after dessert, and the conversation continued, though it felt heavier now, more charged. Marcus asked about my favorite books, my childhood, and dreams I'd long forgotten. I can't remember the last time I talked about this stuff, I admitted. Well, I'm glad you're talking about it now, he said. You deserve to be heard. Something in his tone broke through the walls I'd been holding up for so long. For years, I'd felt invisible, like my life had become a list of tasks and obligations. But here, in Marcus's living room, with his undivided attention, I felt seen. It was intoxicating. When I finally stood to leave, the clock had crept past midnight. Marcus walked me to the door, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the handle. Thanks for coming over, he said, his voice low. Thanks for dinner, I replied, my heart pounding. For a moment, we stood there, the space between us shrinking. It would have been so easy to close the gap, to let this moment spiral into something I couldn't take back. But instead, I stepped back, forcing a small smile. Good night, Marcus. Good night, Emily, he said, his eyes lingering on mine as I turned and walked away. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart still racing. Tonight had been innocent. Sort of. Nothing had happened. Not really. And yet, everything felt different now. The rain had started just after sunset, soft at first, then building into a relentless downpour. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the sound of rain against the windows the only company in the quiet house. David hadn't called all day, not that I'd expected him to.
When the knock came, it startled me.
It wasn't frantic, but persistent, the kind that demanded attention. I glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. Who shows up unannounced at this hour? Opening the door, I found Marcus standing there, soaked to the bone. His t-shirt clung to him, rain dripping from his hair and onto the porch. Marcus, I said, surprised. What are you doing out in this weather? My power's out, he said, offering a sheepish smile. Figured I'd see if your lights were still on. He held up a bottle of wine like a peace offering. Also brought this, so I'm not completely invading unarmed. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Come in before you drown. He stepped inside, leaving a small puddle of rainwater by the door. I handed him a towel and motioned toward the couch. Thanks, he said, drying his hair. I wasn't sure if you'd even be home. Where else would I be? I said with a shrug. This is the exciting life of Emily. Rainy nights and library books. He smirked. Sounds like my kind of party. We sat down, and he poured us each a glass of wine. The warmth of the room, the glow of the lamps, the sound of rain hammering against the windows, it all felt oddly intimate. So, I said, breaking the silence, no power, huh? How bad is it? Bad enough that the place is pitch black, he said, swirling his wine. And quiet. Too quiet. I guess I'm not used to it. Quiet can be nice, I said softly. Sometimes, he agreed, his eyes meeting mine. But other times, it just makes you realize how alone you are. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I felt my throat tighten, the weight of his honesty hitting harder than I expected. Marcus, I started, but he cut me off gently. I didn't come here to dump my problems on you, he said. Being here, talking to you, it makes things feel lighter. My chest tightened. I didn't know how to respond. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt more like a pause than a void. Finally, I said, You're not dumping. And for what it's worth, you've made things lighter for me too. He smiled, but there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite place. Something tender, something unresolved. Can I ask you something? He said, his voice quieter now. Of course, I said, unsure of where this was going. Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions? He asked. Like you're stuck in a life that doesn't really feel like yours anymore? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My instinct was to deflect, to brush it off, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't asking for small talk. Yes, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. All the time. He nodded, as if he already knew the answer. It's hard, he said. Living like that. Pretending it's enough when it's not. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly. Marcus, what are we doing? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on mine. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know I've felt more alive in the past few weeks than I have in years. My heart raced. I wanted to look away, to create distance, but I couldn't. His words, his presence, they had a pull I couldn't fight. This isn't, I started, but the words caught in my throat. It doesn't have to be anything, he said, his voice soft but firm. Not if you don't want it to be. I'm not here to complicate your life, Emily. He stopped, searching for the right words. I just needed to be here. I didn't know what to say. The air between us felt heavier than the storm outside, charged with something we both felt but couldn't name. Finally, I stood, needing space to breathe. I should check on the rain, I said, moving to the window. But Marcus followed, stopping just a few steps behind me. I could feel his presence, his warmth, even without looking at him. Emily, he said softly, and the way he said my name made me freeze. I turned to face him, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The room felt too small, the air too thick. This isn't fair, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I know, he said, his voice steady, but it's real. Before I could say anything else, the lights flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to full brightness. It was enough to break the spell. I should probably go, Marcus said, stepping back. Yeah, I said, my voice shaky. He grabbed his jacket and paused at the door. Thanks for letting me crash your evening. Anytime, I said, and the word lingered in the air like an invitation I wasn't sure I meant to give. When he left, I stood by the door, staring at the rain-soaked street. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. Nothing had happened. Not really. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. The rain had stopped by morning, but the weight of the previous night clung to me like the dampness in the air. Marcus's words replayed in my head. It's real. I wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to a moment of weakness, but the way he'd looked at me, it was impossible to ignore. By the time evening came, I still hadn't shaken the feeling. The silence in the house was louder than usual, suffocating even. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would steady my nerves, when a knock at the door shattered the quiet. It was Marcus. He stood there, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should have come. His hair was damp from the lingering drizzle, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. I know it's late, he said, his voice soft. But I needed to talk to you. I opened the door wider, stepping aside.
Come in. He didn't sit this time.
Instead, he paced, running a hand through his hair as if searching for the right words. Emily, he started, stopping to face me. His eyes were intense, holding a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I can't keep pretending that what's happening between us doesn't mean something. My breath caught. I gripped the back of the couch, trying to ground myself. Marcus, it's complicated. I know, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But I need to say it. I need you to know how I feel. My heart pounded as he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in for too long. You're in my head, Emily. Every day, every moment. And I know it's wrong, I know it's messy, but it's real. And I think you feel it too. I froze, his words crashing over me. Part of me wanted to deny it, to push him away, to protect the fragile life I'd been holding together. But the other part, the part that had been ignored, unseen, unheard for so long, wanted to step closer. Marcus, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't understand what you're asking. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not trying to ruin your life. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself, as if I could hold the pieces of my crumbling resolve together. Do you think this is easy for me? I've built the life, Marcus. A messy, flawed, imperfect life, but it's mine. And I can't just throw it away because... Because what? He asked, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Marcus stepped closer, his voice softer now. Emily, I'm not asking you to throw anything away. I needed to tell you the truth. I couldn't let this go unsaid. I turned to face him, tears welling in my eyes. And now what? What do you expect me to do with this? With us? I don't know, he admitted, his own voice shaking. I don't have the answers. But I know I care about you. I know you deserve more than being invisible in your own life. The words hit me like a knife. He wasn't wrong, but that didn't make it easier. I can't do this, I said, stepping back. I can't let this go any further. You don't have to, he said. But don't tell me you don't feel it too. Don't lie to me. Or to yourself. The room was thick with tension, the unspoken truth between us filling every inch of the space. I don't know what I feel, I whispered finally. But this can't happen. I won't let it. He nodded slowly, pain flashing in his eyes. I get it, he said.
Ida.
But I'm here if you need me. For anything. Before I could respond, a sound broke the moment. A car pulling into the driveway. David was home. Panic flashed across my face as I stepped back, putting more distance between us. Marcus seemed to understand immediately. I should go, he said quietly, grabbing his jacket. Marcus. I started, but he shook his head. It's okay, he said, giving me a small, sad smile. Good night, Emily. He opened the door just as David stepped out of his car. The two of them exchanged a brief nod, Marcus slipping past him without a word. David walked in, setting his suitcase down. Who is that? He asked, glancing toward the door. Just Marcus, I said quickly, trying to steady my voice. His power's still out. He needed to borrow something. David nodded, accepting the explanation without question, but I could feel my hands trembling as I picked up my wine glass. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. Marcus's words echoed in my mind, colliding with the weight of my choices. I had drawn the line. I had told him it couldn't happen. But deep down, I knew I wasn't as certain as I wanted to be. And that terrified me more than anything else.